I was born in Hamilton, Ontario, in between Toronto and Niagara Falls.
So born a Canadian, and eventually you moved to New York City for work, correct?
I did. I moved down in 2000, the year 2000, and brought my wife and kids as well.
And which company were you working for?
I worked for a company called Eurobrokers MaxCore. I was a money market broker. I used to trade US dollar and European currency.
And so, just like everybody else, on the morning of September 11th, what kind of day were you anticipating before everything happened?
Anticipating. I love the energy of the city. I would get on the train at 5:42 in the morning and take the train from my town down into Hoboken and then take the PATH train into the city. And just the energy from getting off the train, getting onto the PATH train and running into the World Trade Center. It was energizing.
And so you got the 5:42. What time were you at work?
Probably around 6:40, 6:50.
Okay. So you were at work a couple of hours already.
Yeah, you had to get in early just because it's 24-hour markets. So Tokyo was closing their markets, the Asian markets were closing, London and Europe was halfway through their day, and we were just starting our day. So.
Did you ever have any misgivings about working at the World Trade Center, given that there had been a bombing several years before that?
No, I was working in Toronto when the '93 bombing happened, and I guess I don't want to say clueless about it, but terrorism wasn't on my radar.
So explain what happened and what you remember as the first plane hit the other tower.
So we were in the trading room and everybody was analyzing numbers, talking to their clients, running through what had happened the evening before and what was happening in Europe with the markets. And then we were settled into the day, and back to the right there was a loud explosion. And then we looked to the right and just saw a huge fireball sucking in on itself, and thousands of pieces of paper just billowing outside the Trade Center. We ran over to see what had gone on, and there was a huge gaping hole in the side of the building, and people in the windows. And some people were doing the unthinkable. The heat was so intense that they decided to jump.
You saw that?
Yeah. I didn't know, when we were trying to listen to the news, they said a light aircraft had gone off course and crashed unexpectedly into the World Trade Center. So, and the PA system were saying the same thing, that, building 2 is secure, please go back to your desk.
Did you think about leaving at that point?
I didn't. A lot of my colleagues that were there in '93 had left, but there were no words of terrorism or anything. It was just, I went back to my desk and I was taking phone calls basically from some of my clients, friends and family as well. People were leaving the trading room, and then eventually a friend of mine up in Canada who was a trader called me and yelled at me and told me to get out of the building.
And the second plane was about 17 minutes after the first one?
Yeah, so I grabbed a colleague of mine and we were leaving the trading room when the second plane hit. So American Airlines Flight hit from 78 to 85, and the right wing sliced right through our trading room.
So if you had stayed there a few more minutes,
yeah, I probably wouldn't have.
Would have been the end. What floor were you on?
I was on the 84th floor.
So the impact is below you. So the fire and the smoke is emanating from below you. What do you do next?
Well, we got knocked flying, and then all the ceiling tiles came down, and I picked myself up and my colleague Mike, and we cleaned ourselves off, and there were other people in the hallway, and we went towards the stairwell the elevator banks obviously were shut down, so we went towards the stairwell and went in the stairwell. We started to go down, and I guess about 2 flights down we met this heavy-set lady being carried by 2 men, and they said, "You can't go down there, there's too much smoke and fire." At that point, we heard, I was with a few of my colleagues, we heard this cry for help. And I went with one of my colleagues to try to help this man who was trapped a floor below, and try to help him, but I was overcome with the smoke. And so I headed up, started climbing the stairs with my other colleagues.
Climbing up?
Yeah, when they said there was no way we could go down below, we started to climb, and we tried every floor, and I guess we got to about the 91st floor, and realizing that there was no exiting. All the floors are locked from the inside for security reasons, right? So at that point, I guess true panic started to set in, and I realized I just wanted to get out and see my wife and kids again. So we started to head back down, and I guess we got down to our floor, maybe a floor below, but the smoke was really thick and heavy. So people were lying down, trying to get beneath the hot, choking smoke. And we were drifting off. We were starting to go to sleep. At that point, I heard a voice, and someone calling me and telling me to come this way. For those who are God-believing may understand who that is. Others may say it was just my adrenaline-fueled synapses working overtime. But, if I heard a voice like that again, I'd go towards it because it made me get up. And I went towards the flame and the fire and the thick smoke, and in a last-ditch effort for air, I pushed against the wall, and it revealed the staircase down below. So I slid down there, and then I ran through 3 flights of stairs that were on fire.
With the adrenaline running as high as it was it agonizing immediately, or was it only after you?
I didn't even feel it. I didn't even realize that I was burnt. I just ran through it and then kept running and running and running. Like I have burns on my arms and my body, but I guess I got about halfway down and I ran into 3 firefighters that were coming up. I explained to them that I was having trouble breathing, and they just told me to go down below. And once I got there, I would get some help down below.
What happened when you got to the ground level?
So I just wanted to get out of that place, and I came out the exit facing the courtyard in between the 2 towers, and there was a security guard there, and she wouldn't let me out. She said, and you look back on it and there were bodies and debris, and there was stuff falling out of the sky. So they wouldn't let us run outside there. They made us go down underneath through the path system to get out towards the Church Street exit. As I went down one set of stairs there, I came across a colleague of mine who was walking along, and he was a sweet, jovial man. And as we were walking towards the Church Street exit, that's when we heard the loud explosion. I looked to my right, and I saw a huge fireball coming at us, and I just yelled at John to run. The building had started to implode at that point, and we ran.
Do you remember what that sounded like?
Yeah. ran as fast as I could to try to get out, and got knocked on the head, and woke up 3 days later in the hospital.
Did you remember at that point much of what had happened, or no?
A couple of things is that I didn't know the buildings had come down. I just, when our building got hit by the plane, I thought it was just a generator down below had blown up. And everybody was telling us, right? It was like the first plane that hit, it was just, a light aircraft had gone off course. So when the second one hit, it's different because the world's watching now exactly what's going on. But you're watching from the outside. I was on the inside. I had no clue what had happened. And my wife didn't tell me probably for 7, 8 days.
What were the extent of your burns and other injuries?
So I got hit on the back of the head. I have a major laceration on my head here. I had burns on 60% of my body, and my contact lenses were melted to my eyes. So,
how did they deal with that?
I don't know. The optometrist or ophthalmologist peeled them off, I think, and I went through extensive testing on my eyes. And I have debris. I had debris in me for a while. So,
how long did you stay in the hospital?
I just stayed 12 days. When I realized what had happened, when my wife told me, I was quite antsy being in the city. I was at St. Vincent's Hospital right down by the Trade Center. So I was quite agitated, and I didn't want to be in the city anymore. So they brought me home, and I got home care.
And how many children did you have at this point?
We have 4 children. So.
And what ages were they?
Back then they were 10, 8, 6, and 3. So.
Wow. How had life changed for you and them as you all deal with this?
Yeah, I was kind of blank for a couple of years. Didn't really, didn't want to hear noises. Didn't really pay attention to the kids. I just kind of existed, and my wife took the brunt of it all. We were not new immigrants, but we were new to the country relatively, and she had to keep the house together and keep everybody organized and keep the kids going, and it was a slow recovery for me, just mentally and physically, mentally more so. But
were you able to return to work, or how long till you were able to?
So I went back to work part-time in March, full-time in April. But when I went back full-time, it was tough on the kids because they would sit by the window wondering every night if I was coming home. And with the anthrax scares that were going on, I said to my wife, you take your passport and the kids' passports. I'll take my passport into the city. And if anything should happen, you just go back to Canada with the kids. And we realized that this was no way for us to live. So
you moved back to Canada shortly?
In the end of the school year, so 2002.
Summer.
We loved living in Jersey and loved being in the States, and we were looking to purchase a home, but that uprooted everything.
You mentioned you were kind of blank for a couple of years. What helped to bring you out of that?
I don't know. I just, probably people talking to me and just saying, some getting angry that I was blank, and rightfully so. I just didn't really care much about anything. And then, others telling me that I needed to tell my story, that it was, a hopeful story. And I don't know, I lost 61 colleagues, so I have survivor's guilt. Could I have gone back and got those people? If I did, I know I wouldn't be here today, but I'll carry that with me.
Obviously, the building came down very quickly after you were able to get out. At what point did someone conclude that you were probably the last person to get out? Or how did you?
Yeah, I don't know who gave me that title. I just, there were 4 people above the impact zone that got out. One was 2 were my colleagues, and they got out physically unscathed. And the other was the guy we were helping, Stanley. And I almost didn't get out, so I guess they presumed that I was the last man to get out before the tower collapsed.
What do you hear from other survivors or even family members of those who didn't make it that day when they hear your story?
Yeah, for the longest time I didn't want people to see me. And, some of my colleagues were asking, did you see my husband? Did you see my spouse? Were they frightened? Were they scared? That was a big burden. I still talk to some of my colleagues' spouses on September 11th. Every September 11th, I reach out to them. But it's kind of tough when you get out and they didn't, right? And I didn't do anything differently than they did. I was just luckier, fortunate, blessed, I don't know.
You mentioned that you talked to some of them on the anniversary of 9/11. Are there other things that you purposely do each year on that date?
I never work that day again, so I take that day for myself. Reflect and give gratitude.
What do you want people to know about what you saw that day from the inside that we couldn't possibly see?
Yeah, it was just the panic in people's eyes that day when that happened. And, people across the courtyard there in One World Trade frantically gesturing for help. It was hard to see.
Have you been back to New York?
I do. I go on the anniversary I go probably yearly, but on the anniversary I go every 5th year and spend the weekend there with my wife.
Ron, is there anything else you want to share about that day or since then?
Yeah, well, the biggest thing is, I think, people say, wow, look at Ron, what he's gone through. I think my wife had it harder than I did. Like, I was out of it for days and weeks and months. I was blank. My wife was there watching and going to funerals when my colleagues, and she was, having to grieve, and she was the lucky one, but she had a big journey ahead of her. And so, I don't know, I get all the accolades, but I think it was harder on her than it was on me.
I love everything about flying, from the challenge to the freedom to the discipline, from the physical sensations to the intellectual demands. Everything about flying is transformational. What I loved about the F-16 was all of that in a jet that you just became part of. It wasn't something you flew, it was something you strapped into. I mean, if you thought it, the jet did it. But it was more than just flying, because we've got the tactics and the mission. So I often describe it as playing chess at 500 knots and 9 Gs. I was sitting in a scheduling meeting on the morning of 9/11. It was a skeleton crew in terms of the squadron. We had very few people there that morning. only enough to send up a 3-ship for that morning's flight. So there was a handful of us in that scheduling meeting that morning. We first learned that the World Trade Center was hit when an enlisted troop, David Callahan, interrupted our scheduling meeting and said, an airplane crashed into the World Trade Center. But the way that he said it didn't provide any indication that it was an airliner that had deliberately targeted and aimed itself to crash into the World Trade Center. So we only thought that it was a small general aviation aircraft, like the one you see behind me. And so we didn't think that any serious damage had been done because we didn't see the images. It wasn't until David Callahan came back a second time and said a second aircraft hit the second World Trade Center, and it was on purpose, that we got up, we went to the Fighter Squadron bar, and we saw on the television what everyone else saw that morning. That was when we knew our nation was under attack. The primary challenge that we had that morning was that even though we knew that we needed to get airborne, that we had to protect the nation's capital, we had two primary challenges. One was that as the District of Columbia Air National Guard, we did not have a chain of command, a line of authority that could give us authorization to launch and get airborne to protect and defend the nation's capital. As an Air National Guard unit, our standing chain of command is civilian. For most Guard units, it goes up to the governor. That's how units get ordered to fight forest fires and build sandbags for floods. Our civilian chain of command doesn't go to the mayor of the District of Columbia, it actually goes to the President of the United States, which was not something that he typically utilized. So that chain of command was very difficult for us because our federal chain of command, which is utilized when we go to war, was not something we were part of. You need to remember that we were not part of an alert unit. We were not sitting alert. And as a matter of fact, the nation had more than decimated our alert capacity after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. They had literally cut the Air Force in half. So while we had sat alert at one point in history, we no longer did, which was the other reason why we didn't have any live weapons. That was our second problem. We needed to get actual missiles, live missiles, built up and loaded on the jets. We knew that we needed to get airborne. The Pentagon was hit, but we still did not have orders to launch. We still did not have the authorization from the right authorities, the command authorities, to be able to launch. The guys in the bomb dump, our weapons troops, they were building up the missiles, but we would not get those missiles in time. It would be nearly an hour after the Pentagon was hit before Vice President Cheney, in our chain of command, said, "Aren't there fighters at Andrews? Somebody get them airborne." The White House JOC, the Joint Operations Center, called us, and they only knew our number because of the Secret Service. They called and said, "What can you get airborne? Do it now." After we got the call from the White House, Mark Sasseville looked at me and said, "Lucky you're with me." Dan Kane, Raisin Kane, our weapons officer, and Brandon Rasmussen would wait until they got missiles. I remember running down after SAS down into our life support, where all of our life support gear was, all of our flight gear. And SAS said that he would ram his jet into the cockpit. I would ram my jet into the tail of the aircraft. The reason why SAS would aim for the cockpit was to take out the terrorists and the flight controls, and I would take out the tail of the aircraft, because without the tail, an aircraft becomes aerodynamically unbalanced and will just dive straight into the ground. When I first realized that we might have to ram our jets into an airliner threat, that this could potentially be a suicide mission, I thought about Pearl Harbor. I thought about the long line of not just airmen, but all service members who have answered the call. And although in the military we don't plan on doing suicide missions, if this was what my nation needed to do, that was my purpose. That was why the universe had put me there. I had peace with it. The FAA had already started to ground airliners before we took off. Our intelligence officer, David Nux McNulty, had been doing what we now call open source intelligence to find out what the air order of battle was, so what things looked like in the airspace and what airliners might still be airborne. We thought that there was a possibility of up to 3 unaccounted for aircraft in our region. when the White House called us, they were also tracking this, and they knew that there was an airliner that had near Cleveland descended, turned around 180 degrees, and was headed back towards DC. That was the track that they wanted us to search out. When we took off, I remember the sky being eerily silent because the DC area is normally pretty packed with airliners. But when we took off, we had the skies virtually to ourselves. I distinctly remember we took off to the north that day on runway 1 right, and we stayed fairly low, and as we turned left to the northwest, the stench of the smoke coming through the ECS, and I looked down and I could see the smoke billowing from the side of the Pentagon as it drifted over the Pentagon and towards the mall. But I didn't have much time to think about it, and I certainly didn't really have any emotional response because I had a job to do. After we pushed out to the northwest to sanitize the airspace and try to find this airliner, we went 100 miles, I don't really remember, before SAS realized that we needed to return back to DC to make sure that if for some reason our axis had just been a little bit off, he needed to ensure that we didn't get flanked by any incoming threat. At that point in time, his primary concern was setting up a combat air patrol where we could respond. So we always had one fighter radar downrange. And he also spent time with the air traffic controllers, teaching them how to speak fighter pilot language so that they could facilitate not only our intercept in case we needed to commit out towards a threat, but also so that they could begin helping us filter what radar contacts we had were known and friendly aircraft or unknown and potentially hostile aircraft. It was amazing how the Potomac air traffic controllers were able to mentally shift their job, right? Because if you think about it, their job is normally to sequence airliners along known highways in the sky and keep everybody separated. But now what we needed them to do was, in a totally messy and confused airspace, facilitate our ability to intercept and then, basically rejoin on an unknown entity. They also needed to help us filter the airspace so we knew who the good guys were and who the potential bad guys were. When SAS first set up our combat air patrol with just the two of us, there were other contacts starting to pop up, whether or not it was on the Potomac air traffic controllers radar or our own radars. The first thing that we did was work with Potomac air traffic control in case they knew what that contact was. If it was a known and a friendly, then we could just leave them alone. But if it was an unknown contact, we would commit out of the combat air patrol to do a visual identification to see what it was. Was it a helicopter? Was it a light aircraft? Was it a twin? Was it an airliner? We had to rely on visual identification because at that point in time, we didn't have any other methods. I think it was probably about 45 minutes after we took off before Dan Kane and Brandon Rasmussen got airborne. They needed to wait until they were armed with live missiles, AIM-9s. And once they finally got to the combat air patrol, once they finally got airborne, that's when my personal pucker factor went down. When Raisin and Igor finally got airborne, what we did was SAS changed the orientation of the combat air patrol. So previously, we had been on a counter-rotating combat air patrol, so one of us was always looking westward. When Raisin and Igor got airborne, what SAS did was reposition the combat air patrol so that it looked more like an X. So SAS took the northwest leg, I had the northeast leg, Raisin took the southwest leg, and Brandon had the southeast leg, so that we could always have, we were basically patrolling different sectors at that point in time. I don't think that we learned about Flight 93 at least until after we landed from our first sortie, and it might have even been after the second sortie. What we cared about was what was going on in the moment and making sure that we maintained our vigilance and were investigating and protecting the airspace around the nation's capital. During the second mission, we were directed to go over into secure voice and receive a classified notification. Sass and I were tasked to go intercept Air Force One to help escort President Bush back into the DC area. We flew to the northwest to intercept Air Force One and his escorts, and then safely bring him back into the DC area. I think when I landed after the second sortie, first of all, I was exhausted. But what we were prepared to do that day didn't strike me as anything special or anything unusual, because I believe anybody would have been willing to do what Sass and I were prepared to do that day. We took off knowing that if we were successful in our mission, that we would not be coming back. But what we were willing to do that day wasn't unique or special, because anyone, any other service member who had been in our position would have been willing to do the same thing. But to be honest, any American would have been willing to do the same thing. And I can say this with confidence because the passengers on Flight 93 did. They were ordinary Americans who had not raised their right hand in oath like we have. But they still made the choice to attack the terrorists, fight their way into the cockpit, and deliberately crash the airliner, sacrificing their lives to protect the rest of us.
So it all started in 1999. I interned at Morgan Stanley, and it was a great time because during that time it was the era of technology stocks, and the market was on a tremendous run. So I fell in love with the industry. That was 1999. 2000, graduated from University of Miami. My goal was always to become an attorney, but I kept getting a call from someone at Morgan Stanley. At the time, it was Dean Witter, Morgan Stanley Dean Witter. And they wanted me to come back into the business and go into their training program. And so I decided to give law school a year, did great, but then I pivoted into the industry, and it was the best decision ever. So the firm would put us up for 3 weeks, and it was the best program out on Wall Street by far. And so we went up to New York for 3 weeks. That morning, I believe there were some elections in the city. So it was quiet. You didn't really see a lot of police officers out on the street. And so we would typically get to the World Trade Center via bus, I want to say by 7:15. So at the time, Philip Roth, which was our chief technician at the firm, so he was the person in charge of just teaching us about charts for the market. And so he ended his session a bit early, and at the time, my very good friend, Bill Van Scoyk, was our MTA, which is the person in charge of the program. And he said, we have 20 minutes, make sure you get some coffee, and don't leave the building, because the session's going to start very soon, and you don't want to be late, because if you're late, pretty much you're gone. I mean, they were pretty strict. But at the time, we wanted to take a break. It was my first time alone in the city, so I wanted to take a look at what the city had to offer. So I just went downstairs with a couple of folks to go grab a cup of coffee. And so when we went downstairs, that's when we walked out of the turning doors. We walked out, and that's when somebody which was walking by, it was bizarre, someone with a book bag, a young person walking with a book bag, said, get back in the building, get back in the building. And at that time, you started to see that there was debris coming down, and it was because the first plane went through World Trade Center 1.
And is that the tower you had been in?
I was in World Trade Center 2.
You were in 2.
Yeah. So we start running back into the building, and half of us are going one way, and the other half are going the other way, and then some of the debris was falling onto the building and was hitting some of the folks that were behind us. And I just remember looking back, and it was either a piece of the building or the plane, just completely flattened out a taxi cab across
Wow.
the street. And that's when I knew that there was a major issue. The person we were trying to get back into the building, but one person we were pushing this way and another group were pushing that way. Everyone was panicking. And so the guy in front of us started punching through the glass to try to get us in. And he finally punched through, we got in, and just mass confusion. And I remember my roommate at the time stating, that was a plane. I heard a plane going through, hitting the building. And I said to him, I said, Alan, planes aren't allowed to fly around, that close to the buildings. That had to be a generator or helicopter maybe hitting the building, but it was the plane. And what's interesting there is that at the time, I left everything upstairs. I mean, my phone, wallet, and I told my roommate, I have to go upstairs. I have to go grab my stuff, all my personal belongings up there. And he said, no, don't do that. I'm like, I'll be right back. So I walk up to security, and they're like, well, there was an accident, World Trade Center 1, you're cleared, we're safe, you can go upstairs, take the elevator up. And he pulled me aside again, he said, look, do me a favor, please. If you're gonna go upstairs, you have to say a prayer with me. And I've known him for, I think, 48 hours. And I didn't want to be rude, so I said, okay, I'll do it, fine. I was more concerned about my personal belongings and being late to class, right? So he grabbed my hand, said a prayer, and I don't know what it was, but something just completely changed my mind, and I decided to stay. And so as I reflect on it throughout the years, if I would have taken that elevator up, right, because you connect on the 61st, I believe at the time we were on 64, I probably would have been in the elevator shaft when the second plane hit.
So what did you do after you decided not to go back up?
We were just trying to figure out what the next move was. We were still confused because we knew something happened outside, and but inside it was calm, and security again was very assertive that everything was fine. But then all of a sudden we started seeing folks running downstairs and panicking and running out of the building, and that's when we decided that, look, we need to get back to the hotel. Something doesn't seem right. And so we started quickly walking through the lobby of the World Trade. We were still in World Trade Center 2, and we're in the lobby, and we're walking out, and all of a sudden you start seeing a lot of folks running. And I'm assuming that all these folks were seeing what was happening in World Trade Center 1, and so took the emergency exit and just wanted to get out of the building. So we started walking a bit. We were quickly trying to decide which way we were going to leave, but we were still kind of trying to figure it out. It was just very confusing at the time. Then all of a sudden, we started seeing a tremendous amount of people running, and we decided, okay, we can't be last out. So we started running. And all of a sudden, when we were about to hit the exit, I remember the entire floor just shaking. And that's when the plane went through World Trade Center 2. I remember running out, and the first thing I did was I stopped and I looked up. And that's when I first saw both towers on fire, engulfed in fire at the top.
And was there more debris coming down because of that
There
second
was.
impact?
Yeah, and so I ran across the street, and I looked up, and it looked like it was snowing from all the paperwork from the two towers. They were just all coming down slowly. It was amazing. And I remember across the street there was a work van and had the AM radio was all the way up. And so I'm listening to it while I'm observing what was happening. And the person on the radio was stating that he thought it was an attack, a terrorist attack, because 2 airliners went through both towers. And but I remember just everyone running out of the towers, pure panic, people running over people, just trying to get away. So it was an astounding moment. And so I was observing what was happening. So the towers were on fire. And then unfortunately seeing folks jumping off the building.
You witnessed that?
Yes, yeah. And I'll never forget someone standing next to me saying, "Look at them jump out like flies. They're jumping out like flies." And so I was still in the background, that working van was there and that AM radio was all the way up. And I remember one of the comments that they made was, "Look, those are 2 jets that went through the building, and I'm sure there's a significant amount of fuel in those towers." And at that moment, I decided that I needed to leave. I didn't know what to expect. I don't know if the building was going to explode, whether it was going to melt down, but I wanted to seek shelter. And so the firm, at the time, the training class was divided into 2 different hotels. And I decided I'm not taking the subway, I'm not getting in the cab, I'm just going to run all the way up to Lexington. I think it was around 55th.
It's a good hike.
Shelbourne. Yeah, it's a hike. But at the time, I wanted to find a payphone to call home to let everybody know that I was fine.
What is your mind even able to process the reality of watching people jump from the windows?
To this day, I still reflect on that, and it's a tough moment for me because, especially on the anniversary every year, on that date, I reflect, and sometimes I ask, why me? Why was I spared and other folks not? So very difficult, just seeing folks making the decision whether they were going to unfortunately burn alive or to jump. But after that, after listening to the work van, I decided I needed to call back home because I'm sure that my family was watching it on TV, and I know that they thought that I had passed away.
Is that what they told you when you called?
Yes. My mother, my stepfather at the time, and the reason why I wanted to become an attorney was because he was an attorney by trade back in his home country in Colombia. And he walked into my mom's office and said, "Are you seeing what's happening on the news?" And she said, he's in that World Trade Center. And she's like, I can't believe what I'm saying, and that's not what I want to see. And he said, "Don't worry about it. I'm sure I know him. He found a way to get out. Pure luck." But I'm really glad that I called. I was able to find a payphone, and the line was very long, very, very long, because all towers were down, telecommunication towers were down. And so I'm happy I called because once my mother saw what was happening on TV, she picked up the phone and she called the local branch in Florida that I was working out of. And she asked for the manager. The manager was conducting a sales meeting at the time. He exits the sales meeting, gets on the phone with my mother, and she said, "Are you watching what's happening on the news?" And he was briefed, and he said, "Don't worry about your son. I know exactly where he is." This is right after the first plane went through. He said, "Don't worry. I know exactly where your son is. He's on World Trade Center 2, the other building, and he's right in the middle of the tower. That's where we have our classes. Hangs up. She has a sense of relief that she knows that I'm in the other tower. And then a couple of minutes later, then the plane went right through the second World Trade Center, and that's why she thought I had passed away. So I'm very happy that I was able to make a collect call and got in touch with her and just put them at ease. I can remember to this day, I hang up the payphone because there was a big line behind me. Hang up the payphone, wish the person behind me good luck. I started running up the block. I kept looking back. I'm gonna say 3 minutes into 3 minutes after that phone call, the first tower went down.
What are you thinking?
Thinking about all the people that passed away.
At that point, you had no idea if the rest of your class had made it out.
Correct. Fight or flight, and it was at that moment flight, and I wanted to get back to the hotel as quickly as possible. And but just thinking of all the folks that my peers, other folks at Morgan Stanley, and just everyone in general, just devastating moment. And it took me a while to get back to the hotel, but once I got back to the hotel, that's when I had that overwhelming feeling of sadness, because for the first time in my life, I walked into this hotel and some of my peers that I had spent the last 2 days with were all crying and hysterically and couldn't keep their emotions in check because they thought that they were going to die. It was later on that night. There was a briefing, and that's when they told us that the class was fine. So we had over 300 trainees in that class. Again, largest in Morgan Stanley history for wealth management, and so made us very happy, which was a sign of hope. Although it was one of the most difficult moments in the history of our country. New Yorkers always think that there's hope. They fight for their cause. Tough, demanding, but yet at the same time, extremely supportive throughout the entire event. Just seeing the way that the country rallied was incredible. And we've said this before, but we'd love to see the country, act like that, united all the time. For many years, it was very difficult for me to talk about it. And again, it went back to the premise of why me? And so after a couple of years, I started to feel a bit more comfortable sharing the story with family members. It took me a while. And but as every year went on, I felt more compelled to share my story, which is one of hope. One of the things that I really enjoy is when I meet someone new, they'll give me some feedback sometimes in a business setting or just new friends if we move from one city to another. Like, you're always in a good mood, right? You're always in a good mood. And if I don't know them that well, I just tell them, life is short, blessed with a wonderful family. I've always worked at one firm, and life is good. But as I get to know the person and close family friends and colleagues, now they know that the reason why I'm always optimistic and the glass is always half full is because I'm on borrowed time. I shouldn't be here.
I was assigned to this truck, Ladder 114, which is lovingly known as Tally Ho. There was an airborne ranger who jumped Normandy, Jack Carroll. When he got home from the war, he got hired by the department. And when they first got radios, he refused to say 10-4 when you respond on the radio, which you're supposed to do. He'd say Tally Ho. So it used to piss off the dispatchers pretty much, but it sort of caught on and took a life of its own. So now, out of 350 engine and ladder companies in New York City Fire Department, 114 truck is considered pretty much one of the only ones that's called by its nickname, Tally Ho, not its number. So it kind of irks some other guys. It's sort of that, jocular competition kind of stuff. So yeah, so this was my beloved Tally Ho. I was off duty the morning of 9/11, working one of my moonlights. At the time, I was running 3 jobs, trying to keep my wife home, raise babies, and the old-fashioned way. That's how I was raised, and we chose to do that. And morning of 9/11, I was across the harbor in Staten Island North End, delivering heating oil for a company that I work for, Quinlan Fuel. Really great folks, treated me well. And the first plane hit, and I was aware of it. I'm a big news radio guy, and I heard it, and I could see across the harbor, and I could see the smoke of the plane, had hit it, impacted. And being a little jaded from many responses, I was like, it's probably some stupid pilot was trying to get a closer look for his client, and they, the winds over that harbor and up the Hudson River corridor are just brutal. So I figured he just got buffeted over and hit the building. And in, the FDNY, you have 10,000 guys, so they don't want you just, willy-nilly running in after something off duty because of accountability. Very much like the military, there's protocol, there's units, and they know where you are, who you are. So I continued on my day, but in the back of my mind, I was just like, I don't know though, this just doesn't look right. It's a lot of smoke. So I started to head back toward the shop, and I was like, let me, I might have to go. I don't know. I just some weird feeling, and then all of a sudden, second plane hit. I immediately knew we were under attack. We had a training manual in the 90s that said, it was a picture of the towers, and it said, with a bullseye, it said, not a matter of if, but a matter of when, be prepared. So we sort of knew that they were going to come back. So I raced into my command. We have a protocol called recall in New York City, and if you're firefighter, police, EMS, for any large mass incident, like very, very large, you're obligated to respond to your command off duty and check in and find out your further orders. So I raced across the Verrazano Bridge. I told my boss I had to go, and I was flying, and strange enough, there was no traffic. It was just a clear, stunning blue morning. It was warm for September. It was kind of strange to be delivering heating oil. It was like 75 degrees, and I could now see the buildings as I'm coming over the bridge. They're just, fully involved, smoke, and it just looked strange. It was surreal. It was as if I was watching a movie, a horror movie, from my windshield. And got into command, and I checked in, and my ladder company 114 was already dispatched to the trade center, the on-duty platoon. And command said, the 40th Battalion command said, a bunch of guys will be coming in, sign them in the book, and commandeer a city bus and get there. So we did that. Bunch of guys came in, one of the lieutenants came in, Brian, and we basically took a city bus, and the driver stayed with us, and we commandeered it. We threw the passengers off. We took our gear, and we raced to the trade center with the knowledge that our guys were there, our friends, our ladder company. And as we got over the Brooklyn Bridge, mid-span, the second tower came down, and we just became aware that, we just lost our guys. We assumed we lost thousands and thousands of people in the building. And we just felt like, me personally, I felt like I failed them. I felt like I didn't get to my guys, my friends, my team in time. And it was just a strange feeling. It wasn't like we shirked our duty or ducked our duty. We were just late. So we got in there, and we started searching. Initially, they had us search the buildings that were a Side 7 World Trade Center before it went down, and there was reports of trapped people in the big post office over on the west side, and there was just so many different reports coming in, and we didn't have all the equipment and the radios that you would have on duty because we were off duty. So we did our best. We were then redeployed toward the evening time to search the main pile for the people who were trapped, which at the time we figured there'd be hundreds, thousands to take out. And it turned out that the only viable humans that came out were a couple of our members that were trapped but rescued fairly early on in the day. And then well into that night, to the next morning, there was a couple of Port Authority police officers. And if I remember it correctly, they were the only last survivors that were taken out of the pile. And, we were just there for hours and hours, and it just became a little hauntingly obvious that we weren't going to find many people. Everything was just completely destroyed. It was just piles of dust and powder and twisted steel, and you just looked at it and said, my God, if the forces involved in the collapse can do this much damage to this building, how can a human being make it out of it? And unfortunately, in the end, that was the case. I don't think there was more than like 160 intact human beings that were retrieved from the site. One of my dear friends I grew up with, John Shart, we were tight, played football together, baseball together, learned to drive with him. Drank our first beers together when we weren't supposed to at like 15, and he was on duty, he was a fireman, and he died. He died that morning, and I knew going over the bridge that he was on duty, and I knew engine 201, his engine was there, and I didn't want to think about it, but I kind of found out that afternoon that I'd never see him again. And I got home 4 days later, and my wife was trying to, keep things normal for the kids and for everybody. And she said, well, I have some good news. We're going to have another baby. I'm pregnant. And I looked at her and I said, well, that's great, but, I just found out on the way home that she knew by then John was missing, and, I said, John's wife's pregnant too, and he's not going to see his baby. And that guilt just immediately planted itself in my soul. And in May of 2002, his little boy, John Jr., was born, and then 3 days later, my beautiful little daughter, Catherine, was brought to the earth. And I adore my children and my youngest, and it's just, but every step of her life that I've watched, and my two other children, it just brings me joy, but it's shrouded in guilt, because my friend didn't get a chance to share that joy of his children. So, but the shining, I guess, silver lining for me, so to speak, was coming home to find out that I was being blessed with another child, and it just, but this tragedy kind of took away from that, and I feel bad, When we got relieved that next morning and sent back to clean up, we had to walk about a quarter mile, maybe a half a mile from where they dropped us off with a bus up a hill to our firehouse. And I just remember my crew, we were just all hacking, and it was just so hard to breathe. And I just remember going, man, what is wrong? And I said to one of the guys said to me, well, we're all dead. And I said, no, Dan, we made it out. And he goes, no, he says, you feel what you're feeling right now. He said, this is poison. He goes, we're all going to die from this. And, at first I was like, nah, he's wrong. This is just a temporary irritation, And then all of a sudden, it took a little while for it to set in, but for months we all had like coughs, and we were hacking, and it was like a bronchitis, and they called it the World Trade Center cough. And all of a sudden, like in late 2002, but more like I think it was 2003, guys started coming down with some serious respiratory disorders and cancer. So it was almost like this toxic brew of chemicals. And I remember this strange incident. So someone did a scientific study on all the dust, and it was very early on. It was the spring of '02. And at the time, I went with my wife to the baby doctor. She was due, and he had become a friend, you know. I really liked hanging with him. Not that we hung out, but, you know, whenever I'd see him at the doc, just fun conversation, and, you know, common interests. We were both Brooklyn kids. And he looked at me, and I said, "Hey, Doc, can you look at this list of what they just put in the paper, what we were exposed to? What do you think?" And he studied it for a good 2 minutes. And it was about 20 elements that they listed, you know, benzene and, you know, beryllium and iron and, you know, mercury and all these things. And he just looked at me very matter of fact, and he said, "I'm really worried for you." He said, "You are going to get cancer." He didn't even say "you may," he just said "you are." And he started explaining what this chemical does, what that chemical does. And he was pretty right on the mark, because benzene is one of the lists, and benzene is considered one of the main stressors or agitators to cause leukemia, which I have. So, and he just said to me, he said, "But worse than that," he said, "don't have any more children." And I said, "Well, Doc, what do you mean by that? I'd love to have a couple more, you know." And he says, no, listen to me. He says, "This and this causes some serious effects to newborn children, you know, in the embryo, in utero." And he said, "I hate to say this, but I think you guys are going to have problems in the future with people who have children." And sure enough, it's never really publicized, but there's been many, many guys who, you know, had children post 9/11, and now their children have a lot of issues. So to me, you know, the combination of, you know, burning fuels, you know, there was a lot of jet fuel from the planes, there was plastic, there was polyvinyl chloride, you know, the carpeting, the computers, all of this stuff in a combination of just a burn pile. Because, you know, the fires at the Trade Center burned for months, because a lot of them were stuck underground and in pockets. And so there was this constant exposure to smoke and to dust and to chemicals. So we just knew right away, the way we felt, like, wow, this isn't good. And, you know, initially we didn't really have the protection we needed. They handed you a little painter's mask, which within 10 minutes was just soaked completely through from sweat, dirt. You couldn't breathe. You just took it and threw it away, and you just went on your search. So 2011, they picked me up on a blood test, Department Medical, and my bloods were just off the graph crazy. It was a Friday morning, and they pulled me off the truck. I was immediately relieved from duty. I was told if I got a cut, I could bleed to death. So I said, "Well, I want to come in right now to the clinic, the department clinic." You know, it was 9:30 in the morning. And they're like, no, just come in Monday. And they all want to go home on Friday. That's the bottom line. They want to get out of there early because they want to beat the traffic. You know, going south, there's the traffic going to the shore. Going east, there's traffic going out to the Hamptons. And then all of it just percolates in the middle of the city. So I go in that Monday, and I made the mistake of that weekend asking some medical people that I knew in my family, what does this whole no platelets or, you know, thing mean? And they all resoundingly said, "Look, I'm not too happy to tell you this, but that could be blood cancer. That's not good. Get to the hospital." I said, no, I'm going in to see them Monday. And so I go in, and one of the other department doctors is a bit of a, I don't know if I'm allowed to curse on this, but a bit of an asshole with an attitude. No one really liked him, and his whole mission was to get anyone who's sick or hurt back to duty immediately, because that runs into overtime for the department. And I looked at him, he says, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Pardon me, sir." And he says, what are you here for?" And I said, I hand him now my blood work. He takes one look, and I said, he goes, "Yeah, go see your own doctor," who happened to be one of the fire department doctors on the outside, "and you're on desk duty tomorrow." So I said, "Doc, excuse me, can you give me an exam?" I said, my stomach I feel like there's a football gonna explode in my belly. And he went, "Oh, busy weekend," insinuating I was drinking. And he goes, I'm not your doctor. I'm here for your duty status. Go right at desk. Next. And I jumped up and I almost tore his head off. So, excuse me, but because it was my organic reaction that I knew there was something wrong. I could barely get to that clinic that day. I mean, I was just fading. So the admin came in and he intervened and intercepted me before I lost my job. And another doctor overheard it, and she got panicked. She said, oh, she knew this guy was a jerk. She looked at my paperwork and she went, ooh, okay, who's your doctor? I said, so-and-so. Okay, go see her immediately tomorrow. You are not on admin duty. I want you to go for a sonogram, an x-ray, this and that. So she cared enough to get me moving along. So my doctor, who I had the previous history with, right away when I came in, the first thing she asked is, how's the drinking? And I'm like, here we go again. And I said, I feel like I'm dying. And she said, oh, here we go again with the WebMD. And I'm like, oh, God, is this lady my doctor or you know, she just my adversary? Well, 3.5 weeks later, I'm getting stretched out with tests and this and that. I'm waiting for a differential diagnosis as to what the hell is going on. And I show up for an appointment with her that she didn't show up to. And I went down. And the charge doctor that day on the duty, he coded me, he called 911. 2 ambulances came in. And this giant paramedic I knew from the street, we used to cut people out of car wrecks and hand them over to him. He sees me laying there and he's like, what the hell's going on, man? You're as red as a tomato. And he kidding around. He said, well, you out surfing in the sun? And I said, Doc, I'm too fat to fly the surfboard. Here you go. And he takes a look at my paperwork and he went, whoa, how come you're not in the hospital? So this was 3 hours after I went for my appointment and the doctor didn't show up. She comes strutting in, annoyed because they brought her back. And she says, so what's going on here today, Lieutenant? As if annoyed. And the paramedic just completely intercepted it. He says, excuse me, ma'am. And she's like, who are you? I'm paramedic Jones, and so-and-so. I believe this gentleman might have blood cancer. Look at this, this, and this. And she went, pfft. She goes, and it was crazy. I thought I was in the middle of a dream. My stomach now was way out to here. He goes, spleen's about to rupture, this and that. Blood pressure's 240 over 140. And she went, the spleen is probably from drinking, because that's all they did after 9/11. And the blood pressure is probably an anxiety attack. And he went, thank you, have a nice day. Raced me to a trauma center, which was a cancer center, Methodist Hospital. And the doctor took one look at me and he said, why weren't you here 3 weeks ago, a month ago? And I just started crying. I said, Doc, I've been begging for someone to tell me what the hell is wrong. He said, well, we're gonna. They drilled into my hip, came back, six doctors came in, and I went, oh boy. Either these guys are looking to run a tab or I'm a dead man, because usually you see 1 doc, 2, not 6. He told me what was wrong. He said, you know, it's advanced hairy cell leukemia. We got to fly in the treatment. It's so rare. It's coming from Cleveland Clinic. It's going to take whatever. All right. And they laid it on the line, and they said, look, you're going to get hit with 2.5 years of chemo in 7 days, compression protocol, just bags this big, never stop. If it works, you go into remission. And I said, what's that? And they said, well, it's just getting ahead of the cancer. And I said, well, what happens if we don't get remission? And they said, you're going to die. And I just, you know, sledgehammer to the chest. I was just like, okay, how do I tell my family this? So sat my family down. They came in. I never really told my kids what was going on. I told them that I got too fat and they needed to keep me here for a while till I lose weight. And all of a sudden, it's about the 7th, 8th day into this, and once they hit you with this chemo, you feel like you're burning to death from inside out. It's vicious, but it's doing its job. And then walks this doctor, and she sits down and she crosses her leg like this, and she takes a phone call, gives me that again, and then says, what is it that's wrong with you today, Lieutenant, with a very arrogant inflection. And I couldn't believe it, and I had lost my hearing from the chemo, and I couldn't see so well. It just wrecks you. And I was incredulous. I was just like, excuse me? She said it again, and I just dismissed her. I said, you're fired from my case. You're not my doctor. Get out of here. So the folks that were caring for me at that time, they were great. They were wonderful. My nurses were angels on earth, and they saved my life. But it was crushing to serve this department for 22 years. You know, I was on the ceremony team, the honor guard funeral team, trying to, you know, give respect and dignity to the families of the guys we lost and to always cast a good image of our job. And now all of a sudden, in my moment of need, I'm being treated like I don't exist. And I held on to that for a while. There was anger, there was resentment. Now I'm past it. I'm a cancer survivor. I'm a grateful American. And, you know, I still mention it, but I've let that go. But I can't say to you I wasn't a little bit angry for quite a while because, you know, when you're in the world of helping people and in the military and medical, you never turn your back on somebody and just leave them. And I felt like this doctor just left me and just took off, and it hurt. But anyway, been blessed to stay ahead of this now for a long time. It's kind of a mystery remission. You just don't know how long it'll last. But, you know, my father's a miracle. I mean, he was sent home to die in 1978 with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and they gave him a trial study drug, and they hit him so hard for 4 years, every 2 weeks. He's still here. So I'm hoping I have his genes and I have his blessing that I'll last that long as well.